Communicating with God. Is it hard? Should it be hard? What should it look like? Let's find out from our guest today.
Building spirituality, family, health, and business. This is The Giant Builders with Lois Wyant.
Hey, Giant Builders, don't forget my link below for my free PDF on 5 home businesses. Would love to share the ideas with you. All right, let's meet our guest. All right, welcome, Giant Builders. I am so happy that you are here today. And remember, all the social media links are below. Please follow us, leave comments. That would be very helpful. And so today's guest is Jen Weaver. Hi, Jen. How are you?
Hi, Lois. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. I appreciate it. Well, please tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Okay, I'd love to. I wear a bunch of different hats. So I'll start with kind of the family ones. I've been married to my husband, Jared, for going on 16 years, and we have 2 sons. So they're both in elementary school, and my home is loud, and I love it. And I also need quiet breaks every once in a while. We live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area of Texas, and I get to spend most of my days either with my kiddos and or as a Bible teacher. So I really love what I get to do in discipling my children, and both my husband and I do that together. I also am a writer and a speaker. I have a couple books out, and I have a podcast called Good God Talks, which shares really simple thoughts, verses, and questions to go talk with God about in prayer. And so a lot of what I do is helping people experience life with God. And I get to do that in how I live my day-to-day life as we're all learning. We're all learning along the way.
All right, just because I have a favorite person, let me ask you. So do you have a favorite female in the Bible?
Oh, that's a good question. Okay. Yes. And her name is Jael. And she is the woman when God brings the freedom to his people under the oversight of the judge Deborah, when Deborah and Barak go and they're going after Sisera, who's the enemy. God actually lets Jael play a part in that because Sisera comes into her tent, and it's a little bit of a violent story, but she picks up a tent peg and kills him with it by driving it into the ground. And one of the things that I really love about that story is that she operated in strength and partnership with what God was doing in the world. And even in a time where within the actual story, one of the men was like, no, I don't know if I can do this. I'm not sure about this. And so God was highlighting a woman who walked in partnership with him. It's one of my favorites. Cool. Yeah.
Cool. All right. I'm going to have to go back.
Who's yours? Now I'm curious.
Oh, mine. Well, okay. So I have 2. One who's only mentioned because her name is Lois, and that's Timothy's grandmother. So I admire the fact that she influenced generations. But my most favorite woman is the Shumanite woman. I just love the oomph of that woman.
Yes. I love how you said that. I think we resonate as women. I think we especially resonate with people who have oomph to them, to their stories in the Bible, because we need that in our daily lives.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your podcast.
Yes. So it's called Good God Talks. And really, part of why I love getting to do this is because I did not always know that our good God still talked with us. And so a lot of my early years in the faith, my salvation was genuine. I understood that God loved me and I needed his salvation. I needed him to rescue me from the death that sin was wreaking in my heart and my life. But I didn't know that receiving that gift from God invited us into continuing in life with him. And so a lot of my early Christian years were just spent doing things for God that were really heavy. And it was in learning that God actually talked with his people that I started to understand more about what relationship with God could actually be like. And then even as a believer, I think sometimes it can be really easy for us to kind of fall into relational ruts with God, where this is This is my go-to spot, and I have my cup of coffee and maybe a beautiful candle, and I'm going to do a Bible study or a devotional, or I'm going to read the word. I'm going to bring the needs of my life and of the people I love before the Lord. And it's almost like, okay, and that's done. And it reminds me of almost that rut that you can get into in a marriage when you and your husband are dating, where it's like, okay, so we're going to go to like this restaurant, we're going to grab that movie, we're going to come home. And it starts to feel a little bit too habitual, a little bit too programmed. And so sometimes you have to break out of that rut. And so Good God Talks is really a way to help other Christians break out of that rut by offering themes that we see in the Bible and the passages where we see that on display, and unique questions that we can ask God to engage in these ongoing conversations with Him, because He really does talk with us. And it's something I nerd out over it. My husband laughs at me because I study, I prepare for the podcast. Most of the episodes are solo episodes, and they're all 8 minutes or less. I'm a busy mom with a lot on my plate. I want a podcast that can meet moms like me in that season. And so then I record it and I ask God the question. And then I listen to it and I ask God the question again. And so Jared laughs at me. He's like, babe, you ask him the same question, like when you're prepping, when you're recording, when you're listening. And I'm like, yes, because the conversation is often ongoing. And sometimes, even between a couple days, he brings up something new to talk with me about from the same question. And so I love getting to help people connect with God in that way too.
So in your information you sent me, you talked about uncommon conversations with God. What does
Yes.
that actually mean?
Yes. So part of it, I think, is it can feel uncommon to even have these conversations with God. It can feel like, I think there's other people who have an experience like I do, where we might not know that we can even have these conversations with Him. And then some of it is approaching God with different questions, continuing the conversation with Him. One of the uncommon ways that I like to talk with God is asking Him follow-up questions. And
Mm.
I think that it's easy to go to, okay, Lord, what does this say? What does this mean in the Bible? How do I apply this to my life? As we practice conversations with God, those can be a little bit more common of a type of conversation. But what I have found is He'll give me instruction about something, and I'll say, okay, cool, thanks, God, I got it. And I just run off to go accomplish the thing.
Yeah.
And He's saying, no, I'm drawing you in by my answer. Let me draw you in to let's talk about this some more. Okay, God, well, what could this look like? Okay, God, well, what else does this mean? As I'm learning this about you, or I'm learning this about me, what else do you want to show me here? And some of the uncommon conversations that we get to have with God are about less serious topics. I
Mhm.
think too, it's more natural for us to run to God in a place of reliance on Him, which is good. Like, definitely, we want to keep doing that. But it's more natural to come to talk about serious things or super heavy needs. And also, God invites us into this daily life with Him. Again, if we think about our closest relationships, our spouses, our kids, our best friends, we don't only talk about the serious things with them. We also talk with them about the things that make us laugh, or the things we enjoy, or something we came across that we thought they would enjoy, or the smaller pieces of everyday life. And we get to talk with God about that too. One of the questions that I learned some years ago in a class that was really on kind of a freedom ministry, learning how to practice talking with God, the instructor asked us to ask God which pair of our shoes was God's favorite.
Oh,
And at first that was a really hard question for me, because I was like, God does not care about my shoes. Like, this is not an important topic. If I'm talking to the king of the universe, I should only talk about really important topics, right? But God is not taxed. Like, he doesn't ever hit a point where He's like, I'm too tired to have this conversation. Like, he is always ready to engage with us. And so I asked Him the question, and then the prompt was, and then when He tells you, ask Him why. So I asked him the question. This was years ago in my early 20s. And he said, it's these shoes. And they were these high heeled red pumps that I loved. Um, and I said, okay, why? And he said, because you feel beautiful when you wear them.
oh,
And so for me, it was such this sweet little conversation this back and forth interaction with God that made me feel like, wow, God, you noticed that and you like that I feel beautiful. And it started me thinking about and then talking with God more about, oh, God, you like it when I feel beautiful? And he's like, yeah, you're my kid. Of course, I want my daughter to feel beautiful. And so it was one of those things that allowed me to experience this moment with God, this uncommon conversation in a normal everyday moment about shoes.
Mhm.
And we get to have those type of interactions with him all day long. And so Good God Talks is a podcast to help us do that.
That's great. My husband and I had this conversation the other day, which I found interesting in that he said, I don't feel like I pray anymore. And I said, well, expand on that. He said, well, I just talk to God throughout the day, and I don't really like sit down and like bow my head and fold my hands and say a prayer. And I said, well, if you're talking to him throughout the day, isn't that the same? I mean, all what he wants is the conversation. It doesn't have to be in a church position. And I thought that
Mm-hmm.
was very interesting in that, we can be like praying all day long because it's the conversation that God wants. He doesn't really care what our body format is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think there are postures sometimes that help us be aware of him in different ways. But yes, prayer is talking with God, and it's talking and listening. That was another one of those things that I missed for a long time. I would pray, but I really didn't expect he would listen. I didn't anticipate that he would, but he does. And so, yeah, he talks to me all the time in the shower. And I think some of it is because my brain can kind of quiet for a minute. I'm like, okay, yep, I will get to all of the to-do list things in a minute. And he's like, hi, I love you. And I'm like, oh, thank you, Lord. But yes, in the grocery store, in the car pickup line, and with our Bible open, but also afterward, continuing to talk with us about the things that we read.
Yeah. So tell me about why is wonder important to your faith?
Yes. So as some of our listeners can probably guess from the stories I've shared already, I did not grow up with a super life-giving perspective of God.
Mm.
And I knew he loved me, but it was more like I understood mentally that he loved me. I didn't know how to fully experience that he loved me. And wonder is one of those things it is all interwoven in our faith. But I want us to talk about it way more than we do. I think big picture wonder is so vital to our faith because we serve a God who's beyond understanding.
Mm.
He tells us, hey, seek me and you'll find me when you seek me with all your heart. And I seek him, and there's always more that I will get to discover about him. And I will never fully understand all that he is, even with faith being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. That implies wonder. It's okay, I'm going to come in awe of God. I'm going to come curious to learn more about who he is and what he's like, and then who we are as his kids, how he interacts with us. And so there's always these little glimpses that he gives us, and he gives us more. He's like, come, there's always more to know of me. But I love talking about it, even with the wording of wonder, because there's this anticipation of good in wonder.
Mhm.
There's this like, okay, I wonder what that could be like. I wonder how we see God on display in this story. And every time we see God differently, we experience him more vibrantly, and we leave transformed by that interaction that we have with him. And for all of your listeners, I'm sure that they can think back and think of many, at the very least one time, where they're like, oh, I thought God was this way. And then I learned that he is different. And that changed how I live, and that changed how I approach him. That happens because we take him out of the box, or we open the flap of the box enough to say, I wonder if this could be different. And so, one of my books is a poetry book called A Beckoning to Wonder, because God's story is on display in the entirety of the Bible, and it's on display in the entirety of the world. And so he's constantly beckoning us to notice him and to experience him differently.
So, okay, how do you teach your children or project this into your family?
Yeah. So one of the great things about kids is that they're naturally full of wonder. They're so curious, and the littlest things are so fascinating to them. One of my boys the other day, he noticed a metal bottle cap, the kind you need a bottle cap opener
Mhm.
for. And he just sat there looking at this bottle cap and he's thinking, oh, there's ridges on it. And this one is hard. It's not plastic. Like he had all of these questions about something that is so familiar to us.
Mhm.
And so for kids, it's this innate thing to have questions, to be curious, to want to understand. They also have this really great capacity to accept the mystery, where I think as we go into adulthood, some of it is just like this is how we've grown, we're taught, or like, oh, I'm this level of maturity now as a believer. I'm this age now, like I should know the answers to this. And so it can be harder for us to embrace the wonder. And so I actually think my kids help me a lot with wonder, because they're like, okay, well, what does that mean, and how do we know that? And one of the things that we do for family discipleship is I've developed these resources. They're kids' Bible activities, and it's really looking at the truth that we have in Scripture and teaching it to our children through play. Play learning is a huge thing in education because we learn so well when we're able to experience something, when we're able to make choices and join into the discovery of it. And so that's one of the ways that I capitalize kind of on the wonder my kids already have. And I'm like, let's play about this. Like we have a series on how God created the world. And so it's looking at all of the different things that God created and looking at how he spoke and the power of his voice. And then with humans, he made us with his hands. He crafted us. And I wonder what God wants us to notice about that. And where do you see God in the story? And so those kind of things are really fun for them. And it's amazing to see how they engage with God that way. But they also pour back into me because I'm learning from a different way when I'm teaching it to them. But it's also helping cultivate that wonder and awe of me where they're like, what? God did that just with his voice? I can't make anything with my voice. Just like, and so just that the fun, embracing the fun and the playfulness, which I think as adults, we could all use more of.
Yeah, that must be a strong voice.
Right? And I'm like, it is. It is.
For sure. Well, tell us about your book or
So
books.
it's, yeah. So my first book is A Wife's Secret to Happiness. And it's really about if you're a Christian and a wife, then your marriage gets to be an expression of your faith. And so how to partner with God in your marriage and really to see God prove faithful on what he promises us. And then my second book is A Beckoning to Wonder, and it's a fully illustrated collection of Christian poetry exploring God's story. So I had a dear friend do beautiful illustrations all throughout,
Yeah.
and they're very different topics. I've had some people ask, like, those don't seem connected at all. And I'm like, they're not in topic, but they are in the core heart, that everything we do in life gets to be with God. And so in our marriages, if you're married, then you get to partner with God in your marriage. And as humans, as God's children and believers, we get to participate in God's story. And sometimes it can be hard to notice that. We can think of God's story as being either complete, like, oh, God's story is done in the Bible, like that's God's story,
Mhm.
which it is, but God is still alive. And so his story continues. And we can also sometimes discredit ourselves or disqualify ourselves from being part of God's story. Oh, well, that famous pastor, they're part of God's story. Or that big win that I had in my life, or that area that I was victorious in, that's part of God's story. But these awful things that I've experienced, these sad choices that I've made, these painful things in my life, like, or me, even just me, I'm disqualified from being in God's story. But the beautiful part of who God is that he makes space for all of us in his story. And he's not undone. He's not undone by our shortcomings. And so the collection kind of guides us through how we see God's beautiful story on display in the Bible and how we see that in the world, and then how we can engage in that through believing, because we live according to what we believe all the time. And so how we can kind of expand our perception of God, or to notice him a little bit more, to rest in his goodness, and to embrace that wonder, and how that changes our lives. And that's how I've seen it done in my own life too.
I think that God's story is always there, but it's whether or not we're looking at it.
Yes. Yes. I have a line in one of the poems that, like, God's story doesn't change, that our perception of him doesn't take him away, but it limits our vision and our participation. And so he's always inviting us, see more of me. Even scripturally, he says, taste and see that the Lord is good. So he's like, hey, come notice, come partake. You can actually be more involved in my beautiful story than you even realize.
So I hear that you have a new service or a new project as well. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. So these kids' Bible activities that we've been creating as a family and using with our young kids, I actually want to make available to help other parents too, because most of us are real busy and we want to pour into our kids. But we don't always have the time to prep something, to get all the supplies together, or even different resources that I've tried to use before. I'm like, I don't have the time for it. My kids are very active. And so I created these resources that could be done with less than 5 minutes of prep, uh, 20 minutes or less for the activity itself. It could be done as a family, whether it's an adult and one child, whether it's two adults and multiple children. And I was like, okay, well, we're using this with our family. I'm putting the work in. I want to make this available to other parents who really want to help their kids know God through the Bible. So they're kids' Bible activities, and they're on my website, thejenweaver.com/KBA. So kids' Bible activities.
Okay.
And it's this ongoing service that parents can sign up for. You'll get them emailed to you once a week that you can easily use to help with the spiritual formation of your own kiddos.
Oh, that's wonderful. That is really great. All right. Do you have any closing thoughts?
Well, thank you for having me. I love that I love that you provide this as a podcast resource to help believers and to help them growing their families in healthy views of God. I think that's so needed. I think my closing thought would be to anyone listening: if you feel disqualified, if you feel like, oh, I couldn't possibly be part of God's story, I couldn't possibly talk with him the way that these women are talking about, I couldn't possibly know how to teach my children the Bible, you are not disqualified. You are not counted out. God meets us all exactly where we are at, and he provides a wealth of resources to help us along the way, including some that we're talking about here, including podcasts like this one, but mostly his presence. And so my encouragement would be to ask God to show you how he's there with you, and how he's equipping you, and how he's active in helping you and ministering to your life, because that's a prayer he delights to answer. And we know from his word, he is there. He is active, even when we don't see him. So ask him to start showing you some of those ways, and he will.
Oh, that was wonderful. Oh, okay. All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and just your sharing your wisdom. It's God's really using you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. It's been a joy.
Thanks. All right, Giant Builders. See you next Tuesday.
Thank you for listening. This has been The Giant Builders with Lois Wyant.